There are ships sailing to many ports, but not a single one goes where life is not painful. This is a quote from the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa, my favorite Portuguese writer. This was really formative to my character because, as I've mentioned before on this channel, I misspent my 20s vagabonding around Europe and not creating any roots or particularly solid bonds. So this quote shook me to my core because it helped me understand the world, not in a fatalistic, bleak perspective. I don't think Fernando Pessoa was trying to promote despair. I think this is a pragmatic acknowledgement of mortal life, universal mortal life. Not even suffering is certainly not unique to humans. Other earthlings are also privy to this luxury. So I don't think it is an earthly thing. It might be universal for all mortals alike. This was pivotal for me to understand and appreciate beauty, joy, and the endless precious moments that make life so unique. So I have talked about Fernando Pessoa in the past, and this is probably one of the most requested videos on this channel, but it did take a long time for me to make it. And the reason why it took about 6 months for me to make this video, pretty much the entire time that I've been on BookTube, is because I was avoiding cognitive gout. Allow me to explain. Fernando Pessoa's writing is extremely rich. It is rich like port wine and blue cheese. It is so rich in lyricism, subjectivity, and it has a strong focus on meta-language, which is when we use language to talk about language itself, to reflect on its structure, to explore its function, and to study the craft of writing itself. So I reread a lot of his work, poetry and prose, to refresh my memory. And I also read some books about him by scholars known to study Pessoa. We're going to talk about them a little later on in the video. For now, allow me to remind you, if you like books, words, and stories, this is definitely the channel for you. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos. Check out my community tab. I'm always posting polls, quizzes, stuff. And yeah, so welcome to the Linguist Library. Let's talk about the man himself. Fernando Pessoa was born on the 13th of June in 1888, Lisbon, Portugal. And for the beginning of his life, everything was fine until his father passed away from tuberculosis. His father was a known music critic, and his younger brother soon passed away. Between the ages of 5 and 6, a lot of tragic things happened in his life. But fortunately for Fernando Pessoa, his mother was extremely strong. His mother is from the Açores, the Portuguese islands, and they are known for making people made of steel. So she remarried, and they ended up living in South Africa because she remarried the Portuguese Council for South Africa. So Portuguese is Fernando Pessoa's first language, but he was educated in English. His first literary moment happened when he was 12. He wrote an essay on the British historian Macaulay, and he signed it with his family name, Pessoa, which originally had a circumflex accent on top of the O. But later on in his life, he wanted to expand his reach, and he wanted to be a bit more international. You could tell this by his keyboard, which was something that he created, he manipulated so that he would be able to type in 5 different languages, which back then, without a digital keyboard, was quite difficult. But yeah, so he dropped the accent to become a bit more cosmopolitan. He worked as a translator for British magazines. He translated Portuguese proverbs for a British editor called Frank Palmer. But he is really unique when it comes to writers because of his heteronyms. So his heteronyms, which he very kindly explained to a friend on a letter. A few more notes on this subject. I see before me, in the colorless yet real space of a dream, the faces and gestures of Caeiro, Ricardo Reis, and Álvaro de Campos. I have constructed their ages and lives. Ricardo Reis was born in 1887. I don't remember the day and month, but I have them written down somewhere. In Porto, is a doctor and is currently in Brazil. Alberto Caeiro was born in 1889 and died in 1915. He was born in Lisbon, but lived almost all of his life in the countryside. He had no profession and almost no education. Álvaro de Campos was born in Tavira on October 15, 1890, at 1:30 p.m. Ferreira Gomes tells me, and it's true because after doing the horoscope that for that time it matches, as you know, he is a naval engineer from Glasgow, but is now here in Lisbon inactive. Caeiro was of medium height, and although he was truly frail, he died of tuberculosis, he didn't seem as frail as he really was. Ricardo Reis is slightly, but very slightly, shorter, stronger, but lean. Álvaro de Campos is tall, 175 meters, 2 centimeters taller than me. Thin and slightly inclined to stoop, all clean-shaven. Caeiro, blonde without much color, blue eyes. Reis, vaguely dark. Campos between light and dark, vaguely resembling a Portuguese Jew, though his hair is straight and usually parted to the side, and he wears a monocle. Caeiro, as I said, had almost no education, only primarily schooling. His parents died early and he stayed home, living off a small income. He lived with an old aunt, a great aunt. Ricardo Reis, educated in a Jesuit college, is, as I mentioned, a doctor. He has lived in Brazil since 1919, as he voluntarily expatriated himself for being a monarchist. He is a Latinist by external education and a semi-Hellenist by self-education. Álvaro de Campos had a regular high school education. Later, he was sent to Scotland to study engineering, first mechanical, then naval. During one vacation, he made a trip to the Orient, which resulted in an apiary. He was taught Latin by a beta-born uncle who was a priest. How do I write in the name of these three? Caeiro by pure and unexpected inspiration, without knowing or even calculating what I would write. Ricardo Reis, after an abstract deliberation that suddenly concretizes into an ode. Campos, when I feel a sudden urge to write and don't know what. My semi-heteronym, Bernardo Soares, who in many ways resembles Álvaro de Campos, always appears when I am tired or drowsy, so that my qualities of reasoning and inhibition are somewhat suspended. That prose is a constant daydream. He is a semi-heteronym because, although the personality is not mine, it is not different from mine, but simply a mutilation of it. He is me without reasoning or affectivity. The prose, except for what reasoning gives faintly to mine, is identical to this, and the Portuguese is perfectly the same. While Caeiro wrote poor Portuguese, Campos reasonably well, but lapses like saying eu próprio instead of eu mesmo, etc. Reis better than I do, but with a purism I consider exaggerated. It's difficult for me to write the prose of Reis, still unpublished, or of Campos. The simulation is easier, but because it is more spontaneous in verse. also later in life, when he returned to Lisbon, he learned French because that was the de facto language of the Portuguese elite, the European elites, really, at the time. He published, I think I only read one of his stories in French, and most of his early stuff that he published while he was still alive was in English. So he has a collection. He was strongly influenced by Roman poets like Horace. In fact, the entire Western canon was very well treasured by him. So he was familiar with Cervantes, Shakespeare, all the Roman poets that I just described, but also each one of his heteronyms was influenced by a particular writer. Most of Fernando Pessoa's work was not published while he was alive. So he lived from 1888 till 1935. His famous work was mostly written between 1914 until 1934, 35. And everything that was published during his lifetime was mostly in different languages, in English specifically. So he had a collection called Antinous, and then in English, and then he had a second collection, 35 sonnets, which were both published in 1918. He has a collection of English poems, third collection, which was published in 1921, and he gained notoriety because of a national competition that was trying to find the Portuguese spirit. It was about nationalism and national pride, right? So this was 1934, and this is when he published Mensagem, which is a patriotic mystical collection that contemplates past glories from the conquistador era through modern-day Portugal. It rhymes in Portuguese, but I found a way to translate it in English that also rhymes. But loosely, it would be, all is worth the stride if the soul is wide. So when it comes to his books, the translations that I found are quite varied. So you have Richard Zenith's translation, you have Margaret Jo Costa with Geronimo Pizarro, who's a scholar on Fernando Pessoa, and they have translated the complete works of each heteronym separately. Zenith chose to put a collection of all three of the main poets, as well as Fernando himself, together in a collection called A Little Larger Than the Entire Universe. This is by Penguin Modern Classics, and you also have the selected poems, which was not translated by Richard Zenith, but it is an older translation, and it was awarded a poetry translation award called PEN in 1999. So, for his prose, you have the Book of Disquiet, this one being the latest, and this was translated by the Colombian scholar Geronimo Pizarro and the superstar translated Margaret Jo Costa, who is my favorite translator for this combination from Portuguese to English. I refer to her as the Kelly Clarkson of translation, and I stand by that statement. Richard Zenith's biography, Pessoa, a biography, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and I highly recommend it. I read it for this video, and it's superb. He is such a well of knowledge, such a well of information when it comes to Fernando Pessoa. I Am Anthology by the marvelous Geronimo Pizarro, and this is where I found out the 77 exclusive heteronyms that I didn't know of before, including his female heteronyms. So it's a total of 136 heteronyms that Fernando Pessoa created in his life. Before I go, I'd like to read you a poem. This one is called Poem in a Straight Line, and it's by the heteronym Álvaro de Campos. I never knew a soul who ever took a licking. My friends have all been champions at everything. And I, so often vulgar, so often obscene, so often vile. I, so deliberately parasitical, unforgivably filthy. I, so often without patience to take a bath. I, who've been so ridiculous, so absurd, tripping up in public on the carpet of etiquette. I, so grotesque and mean, submissive and insolent, who's been insulted and not said a word. And when putting a word in, growing still more ridiculous. I, who strike chambermaids as laughable. I, who feel porters wink sarcastically. I, who's been scandalous about money, borrowing and not paying it back. I, who when the time came to fight, ducked as far as I could out of the punching range. I, who go into a sweat over the slightest thing. I'm convinced no one is better than I am at this sort of game. No one I know, none of my speaking acquaintances, ever acted ridiculous, ever took insults, was ever anything but noble. Yes, all of them princess, living their lives. How I would love to hear a human voice, from any of them, confessing not to sins but to infamies, speaking not of violent but cowardly acts. But no, each one is a paragon, to hear them tell it. Is there no one in this world who would confess to me he's been vile just once? All you princes, my brothers, enough. I'm fed up with demigods. Where are the real people in this world? Am I the only scoundrel and burglar alive? Maybe women don't always fall for them. Maybe they've been betrayed. But ridiculous? Never. And I, who've been ridiculous but never betrayed, how do I speak to their highnesses without stammering? I, who've been so vile, literally vile in the meanest and rottenest possible sense of the word.